If you're going to go for a continuous provision through Key Stage 1, your approach is going to be very different to a school that is going to have very much the children kind of sat in rows in chairs, etc. by the end of reception. You're philosophically starting from a different starting point. So the way you go about structuring your curriculum, your lessons, is already starting from a different point.
We're always trying to make sure that the busy teacher can access them. And I think some ideas, they deserve the time that it takes to develop things. And when I think about you guys, your approach to professional development, I think you have spent a concerted amount of time thinking about what the future looks like and how you're going to get there.
I think that's done more damage than good, because it's left children confused. It's left concepts poorly taught.
What really interests me there, Tom, is that you're eating the spaghetti after you've thrown it at the wall. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Shannen Doherty and Tom Oakley for a very special 300th episode of the podcast, if you can believe it. I'm sure some of you can. I know Adam Woodward had at one point listened to all of the podcasts, beyond episode 200. So I wonder if now how far away he is from listening to all 300. But if you enjoy the podcast, don't forget you can sponsor at ko-fi.com/TDAPE, or even just leave a review wherever you're listening. Tell us what you've enjoyed the most about the last 300 episodes. So this week we're fielding questions from listeners. Some of those questions came from Discord, some came from email, but they're all about mathematics and the things that are preoccupying listeners' minds as we move into the end of the 25-26 academic year. So without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So Shannen and Tom, it's lovely to see you. How are you both?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, thank you. You, Kieran?
Yes, surviving. I'll be much better when the temperature goes back down. So in a month or so, check back in and see how we're doing. It's great to see you guys. It's been a while since you've been on the podcast. But we've got some questions from listeners, and I thought, because they've got a maths theme, you two would be the ideal people to field those questions. Actually, before we start though, this is actually going to be our 300th episode. I accidentally snuck up. I didn't do anything proper, or like
oh no.
Normally Lloyd interviews me and stuff like that, but this time just too busy and too prolific. Yeah, so 300 episodes, not too bad. Shannen, you've got a new book coming out.
I do indeed have a new book coming out, How to Lead It Primary Maths, which is part of a series that John Hutchinson is editing for Bloomsbury, and the English, science, history, geography ones are already out.
Yeah. Have you read anything, Tom? I read Tricia and Sally's English How to Lead It.
I'm waiting for Shannon's one, and then I'm going to hold that up as the standard for all others to meet. That's the order I'm going to do it in. The most important subject first, and then all the others after that.
Thank you for your support.
And when's that out, Shannen? Is that late August?
September. It is September. I'll say the 10th, but I'm going to check. But you can order it now.
So I've got a birthday between now and then, so if anybody wants to order it for me for my birthday, then I'd really appreciate it.
That's really sweet. I feel like I could just sort you out with a copy for your birthday.
Oh, thanks, Shannen.
It is September 10th. I was right. How sad that I know that.
Well, I mean, if anyone should know that, it should be probably you and maybe the printer.
Yeah.
The two people
Good point. Good point, well made.
Exciting time. So any subject leaders, basically that's going to be the go-to, isn't it?
Subject leaders, aspiring subject leaders, senior leaders, school leaders, covering a lot of bases there.
Question 1 comes from Sam in Discord. It says, I'd love to hear opinions about sharing test scores with parents. We do loads of testing, end of module tests, termly tests, etc., but never share the scores with parents. I have some thoughts, but would be curious to hear others. So I think Chris and Lloyd maybe answered a question, I guess, a couple of years ago, though, in a similar field. But it'd be interesting to see what you guys think. What would you do? I mean, what do you do? Because you're both operational deputy head teachers who probably have quite a strong handle on what happens with this kind of data.
We share test data from statutory assessments, and out of choice, they're the only ones we formally share with parents. So we send those home with end of year reports, and we meet with parents at the midway point through autumn term. So we've done no formal kind of big testing at that point of any great value that's going to teach the parents something they don't already know about where their child sits. So we choose not to share any data at that point. We then have our second parents meeting midway through the school year, just after February half term, usually around about March time. And at that stage, we will choose to share test scores if we think it's relevant to the parent. If it's going to teach them or share something with the parent that they don't already know about their child's progress. So let's say, for example, that their child had previously been doing really well in a subject area, let's do it with maths for now, but their recent testing had shown that child had slipped down or whatever, and we'd identified an area. We might choose to show those tests and explain, we're not just saying this is a hunch, it's seen in the children's work and it's seen in these test scores, or vice versa. If a child's not been doing very well in the subject and all of a sudden they've shown a great uplift in their scores or that kind of thing, or they're showing something they haven't seen before, we might use it to support that conversation, but we don't do it as a matter of course. So when parents come to that kind of mid-year parents' evening, we don't have all of those test papers out, we don't share all of those things, unless we deem it to be specific to the narrative that we're trying to explain about their child's progress.
So we do something fairly similar. We only routinely share the summative assessments that we do. We do an assessment at the end of the autumn, spring and summer terms in years 2 to 5. I'm going to stick with, because obviously year 6 are a slightly different kettle of fish. Year 1, we don't do a formal sit down assessment with them because they're year 1, and a lot of our children are not ready to sit and read an assessment, and also sit there and do an assessment for a long time. Tells us pretty much what we already know about those children. We do termly short reports, so we do an insight print off. They have a lovely format that has kind of the kind of test scores, the general assessment, and there might be a comment as to if a child is assessed as expected but they got a greater depth kind of standardized score, and we do our attitudes to learning. That's like a really quick insight, populates it, print it out job. So they get that 3 times a year. The summer term one is a slightly longer version, so they get 3 test scores a year. Similarly, if we feel like children are dipping or doing particularly well in like our more low stakes or in between assessments, we will informally tell that to parents at parents' evenings. But really it's those 3 times a year summative ones that we do share. I think that it's important that the parents know, because we share it with the children. We give the children back their test scripts and we go through them, and the children are then equipped that information. So I think it's only fair that the parents know as well. One thing we also report to parents is where their children are at with phonics and just the progress they're making towards maybe the phonics screener, and the MTC as well. And we don't do your child hasn't got 25 yet. We do it, actually they're doing really well, this is where they're at the moment. Based on that, we would hope that they would get at the end of the year. And then for Key Stage 2, we do report to them when we do the assessments, but obviously the end of term is the big one. However, who knows when those will come? We may be waiting for a long time for the Key Stage 2 results.
You're going to try to get me in trouble, Shannen, what was the price of that contract? It was like 180 million or something like that?
Shocking.
I could have done that. I wouldn't have made half the mistakes. So, next year, DFE, if you're listening, I'm not a loose end.
We thought that 700,000 on influencers was bad, but
yeah, it's been quite the week, hasn't it?
Maybe if we each put in a tender that is, and we organise our costs between us, we can make sure we get low, because they have to look at least 3 different tender contracts before they choose which one. So
absolutely, we're all doing that.
That sounds like you came prepared for this, Tom. It's something you've been working on in the background. So you guys are doing sort of similar but sort of different, and I think it sounds like it's the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? what's the purpose behind this? Because I don't think there's a right or wrong necessarily. When Sam says I have some thoughts, what thoughts might those be? Do we think? I mean, is there an edge to that question? Is there something that maybe, is there a side of sharing results that can be detrimental or negative, or I don't know, what is there a bit of the jigsaw I'm missing?
I think that oversharing of scores could probably encourage the children to start defining themselves by their test scores. So I imagine a lot of it is in the framing. You know, we're very supportive in the way that we are. I'm sure, Tom, you are as well. I'm sure most people are. I can imagine a scenario where there's a lot of testing, and in Sam's scenario where they're doing low stakes quizzing, end of module tests, those sorts of things, if you're sharing all of that with parents, it can become a bit like over figure heavy, and there's less context. And I wouldn't want children to start beating themselves up because their scores are lower than they were before, not as high as their friends. I mean, we always do the don't shout your score out in class, and then they all go, I got 100. But if, you know, doing that 3 times a year is manageable, doing that for everything that you are testing, I think becomes unmanageable, and probably you then lose the purpose and the why of what you're doing. But I think the only con that I can think of is the children then over emphasizing the importance of the score when there is a wider context to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think sharing raw scores without any context is potentially going to lead to more harm than good in certain cases. There might be several parents that take it the right way or come back with relevant questions, but there might be other parents that overgeneralize, or it becomes just another thread on their parents' WhatsApp conversation group that, as teachers, as professionals, we don't really have any input in, and those conversations can lead down directions that we then have lost control over. So it can be kind of like toothpaste out of the tube, and once that information's gone out, you don't know what the parents are going to do with it. So that's why we prefer to share it in those kind of formal sit-down moments, those conversations, or in those reports in those kind of ways. The one piece that we share in a similar way to what Shannen was talking about in the children's progress was their multiplication tables check, is we try and give context. So throughout that year, we use times tables Rocksdales. So through the year, we'll share with the parents the child's heat map, and they've shown their heat map over time. So then they get it in context. We're aiming towards this thing. This is what your child had done before, and this is where they're at now. So that's the kind of thing that, with a little bit of input, the parent recognizes this is personal to my child. It's not really my child against anybody else. This is my child on their journey from A to B or whatever, and they're at this point. I think that you're okay with, but you can't really do that with everything. You can't really do that with a pre-topic science assessment or anything like that. So I think you've got to pick your moment. And yeah, definitely. I think sometimes a little bit of information can be more harm than good. So don't share if you don't need to.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably sticking it into ChatGPT or whatever these days, aren't they? Just like they do with their complaints. You know, what does this score mean?
Yes, but we do. That's why we do provide that little bit of context on even on our short reports. Just you know, a sentence or two above to say what the range for expected is and what the range for greater depth is, and so on. Just so they have an understanding, rather than just, like Tom said, getting out of context raw scores or out of context standardized scores doesn't help.
I think that as long as parents aren't surprised by the information, that probably makes the biggest difference. You know, if it's something that, if like I say, if in the final report of the year, all of a sudden your child is not working at the expected standard, and you've been under the impression that they were and stuff, I think that could be quite distressing. So I think, I mean, like in the question, it's almost like an undersharing. There's nothing being shared. So I don't know. It sounds like there are plenty of reasons why we would, but like from the parental side, I think as long as we're up to date and know what's happening, at least, you know, we can be involved. Like multiplication tables is a good example. Like the kids who practice those at home with someone are normally the kids who learn them the most efficiently, I think. And so you'd want to be able to do that, you know, with the, like I say, if we could have a heat map for everything, that'd be the dream, because it's, you know, comparing yourself to who you were yesterday rather than comparing yourself to the other kids in the class, which we know, so as social animals we do so naturally. So
absolutely.
Good advice. So Sam, let us know in Discord what you think, and maybe Sam maybe come on one day and talked about this, about what they're thinking.
Most maths assessment still happens in snapshots, whether it's at the end of a topic, a block, a term, or even at the end of a year. Now, those moments can be useful, but how confident are we that they are really giving us an accurate picture of learning over time? So ACEL Pro helps turn everyday curriculum-aligned maths practice into a richer evidence picture. Pupils work through carefully designed tasks, and as they do, teachers can see live how the class is getting on. They can spot mistakes, questions or topics that may need immediate follow-up, and they can decide what to revisit while the learning is still fresh. That evidence then builds into a class picture, telling teachers who may need support, who needs fresh evidence, and who may be ready for professional review. Teachers can also drill into individual pupil journeys with an up-to-date maths snapshot to support conversations with learners, parents, carers, or indeed colleagues. And because the evidence is structured right from the very start, it can roll up to school, trust, or local authority level, helping leaders spot patterns earlier and support the right conversations. Visit ACEL Pro, that is acel.pro, take the interactive tour and see how it could support maths, teaching, learning and assessment in your school.
The next question comes from you, Tom.
My wife's an experienced teacher, an excellent teacher. She's taught single age and mixed age before, but for the last year, the year she's in now, she teaches year 2, and her school's changing to mixed age in Key Stage 1. So she asked me the question, how should I be thinking about preparing a mixed age year 1-2 maths classroom? And it took me back to those days as an advisor, and I'd get asked that question a lot when schools are changing in size, whether their school's growing or shrinking or whatever it would be. What are the kind of practical implications, and what advice would you give to people? I think is a genuine question that lots of experienced teachers will be thinking about, because this change is something that might be new to them. They might never have considered it before. So
I don't think there's a set way though, because I think it's so cohort dependent, because like with every class is going to have quite a range, whether it's mixed age or single age. I'm thinking of the school where I'm a governor, and they have done like separate maths input, so for year 3 and then for year 4 or year 1 and year 2. But then I'm thinking of the school in my last trust where you didn't necessarily need to do the separate maths inputs in the lower years, because some of those children might have been in year 2, but they were not ready for year 2 maths. So I think that you have to really know your children. I think that you have to be prepared for like flexible grouping, like every class. When it comes to phonics, it depends what phonics program you're using as well, because some advocate for lots of mixed grouping across a school, and some advocate for keeping them in their classroom and doing like same day catch up in interventions. So that would impact that as well. I think for maths, particularly in year 1 or 2, you can get away with teaching the kind of the base concept and then stretching and deepening for those that are ready for it. I think it's so child and cohort dependent.
Kieran, where do you stand on that? Because with the phase, specifically that phase, year 1, year 2, we know how challenging it can be to establish expectations and routines in year 1 at the start of the year, whereas actually you don't quite have those same challenges for children joining year 2. They've got lots of those expectations in place. They understand a lot of the routines, that they've been well established. Where do you stand on that idea of taking that kind of philosophical approach to keeping the class together and doing a single input, or doing different inputs for the year 1 and year 2s? From your experience, where would you go with that?
So yes, I think the phase is important, because almost within 1-2, you've almost got contained almost like a family of ideas in maths. And if you were to have a 2-3 split, then I think the response is different, because I think there's the introduction to multiplicative reasoning, and the magnitude gets ever greater. Whereas we look at the same, like certainly whenever I think about it, we're looking at the same ideas but within 10, 20, 40, and then maybe 100. So there's no reason why we can't all be exploring the structures of arithmetic. But maybe I change the numbers, maybe I don't, because I see it's the understanding, and so maybe towards the end we're looking, but like you said, Shannen, if a child is ready for regrouping, the fact that they're 5 doesn't make a difference, I don't think. And like in Cambridgeshire, I know you, because obviously being a trustee in Cambridgeshire, I know how small your schools are. Same in Kent. Like most of the schools I work with in Kent are like, they work with a maths hub because they're so small and they need some sort of support. And there's no one way to do this. And what I think is best is that if it's the least amount of work for the teacher, because what we don't want are the days of having 5 or 6 different lessons, because I don't think that's an effective way to teach, but also B, I don't think it's sustainable for anyone in the modern day, and we shouldn't expect to have to. So I would think about that. Like, I think phonics is, like you say, is whatever you're doing. Like most classes I see split up, and then they spend the first half hour in Key Stage 1 in a totally different room doing that. But with maths, I think we can pedagogically say that it's the right maths for the pupils at the right time, rather than you're in year 1, you're in year 2. I think when you've got a key stage split, you're probably in a more challenging situation. But because we're going to be looking at broadly the same things, and I think that possibly gets easier when we see the reviewed document. And perhaps, obviously I'm speculating because I've had no involvement in the English like redraft, but things like fractions,
which is a crime.
Well, I was already busy enough with other stuff, and I also didn't apply, so it wasn't as if I was rejected, making it sound like they chose not to. We shut it. I imagine things like fractions, things like time, because it's things like money, because what you're introducing the idea of unitizing for the first time. Even time is looking at is proportional reasoning and thinking about things like quarters and halves and stuff. So if any of that gets left to later on, then perhaps year 1, 2 teachers are in for a win. So so that's what my gut says. Like my first school was a small school. There's no one to go there, so we had splits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 the first couple of years, and it really was take whatever approach you think is going to be the most effective for your children, but with the least amount of paperwork, I think. Because I see schools in Kent teaching 2 lessons, and I think, well, how necessary is that? I don't know. Maybe for year 6, but even then, it's a Key Stage 2 examination rather than a year 6 examination. So just teach the right maths. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm fascinated to hear what you guys think. Of course, I have my opinions and my experience from working across Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, and the one thing I'd always say is that no 2 mixed age settings are the same, and there's no reasonable or really reliable data that supports it, because schools can be mixed age for different reasons. There are schools that are in the most wealthy postcodes in the country that are mixed age because their catchments are small and the children are really well supported, and actually the school can do pretty much whatever they want in whichever order they want, and those children have got a pretty good start to life. And then you've got other settings like my setting, Shannon's setting, where those children don't have that same start to life. They might also find themselves in mixed age settings. So comparing the data and outcomes and the journey those children take can be very different. So the one piece of advice I always say to schools is you need to think really carefully about your philosophy, your approach. Like if you're going to go for a continuous provision through Key Stage 1, your approach is going to be very different to a school that is going to have very much the children kind of sat in rows in chairs, etc. by the end of reception. You're philosophically starting from a different starting point. So the way you go about structuring your curriculum, your lessons, is already starting from a different point. But the one thing I say to all these schools, regardless, is that you need to think about what the children need to learn, and then the best way to communicate that to them. And that is the same regardless of their age and stage. So if your core concepts are spatial reasoning, proportional reasoning, additive reasoning, those kind of things, then you've got a common starting point for all of those children, regardless whether they are 5 or 7. And you can introduce those concepts practically. And if you include that in enhanced provision or continuous provision, then you can do so and catch those children in groups through the day or through the week. It is all possible. You just need to be really clear in your mind which way you want to go and why. You cannot let the tail wag the dog and just find yourself stumbling into a situation and go, well, we kind of ended up here, but we don't really know why. So my number one piece of advice to those schools is always think about what it is you want to achieve and how that best aligns with your practices and your philosophy for those children's education, and you will find a way of making it work. But that doesn't necessarily mean copying what the school within your postcode does, because their context is likely to be different for a number of reasons. And the one thing I'd say to subject leaders in that situation is be as supportive as you can to that teacher. Teaching mixed age isn't the same as teaching single age. There are lots of similarities, but be on hand with useful bits of advice or point people in directions, because they're going to need it. And some of those children are more or less ready for those new concepts than others. So be as supportive as you can and just stick to your why, understand why you're going about the way you're doing it. Don't let form or function or whatever the school does down the road guide your practice.
Hello there. I just want to give a brief introduction to how my setting has used the story of maths. As a school, we wanted to upskill teachers' knowledge in how to teach mathematics and explore other pedagogical approaches, and that's where Kieran and Stuart came in. Their scheme, their curriculum, the story of maths, it shows exactly what you need to teach in a really thoughtful way. They consider concrete, pictorial and abstract approaches. Interleaving and retrieval practice is throughout, which has really supported outcomes so far in our early moments of rolling out the story of maths in our setting. There's no request that's too large for them. They very prompt in their support for us and in rolling this out. I'd recommend the story of maths to anyone who's wishing to upskill their school in the teaching of maths and numeracy.
What's one piece of common primary maths advice that sounds sensible, but you think has probably done more harm than good? That was a loaded question that came in via email.
From who? I love this question.
I think most of these bits of advice are well-intentioned, right? They're often given because they think that it will provide a shortcut or an easy win that will get results in the short term. For example, things like teaching the children to use crocodiles to compare quantity or magnitude or size or those kind of things, or adding a zero, those kinds of advice that you hear, like this will get short-term results. I'm always wary of any bit of advice, not specifically just maths, but any bit of advice that's going to get you short-term results without considering the long-term implications, because, and unfortunately, they're often given, those bits of advice are given because somebody feels like it's got them results in the past. I did this thing, it worked for my class, they understood the idea well enough that they could complete the task, and it allowed us to move on to the next bit of the curriculum. And they're the bits of advice that I'm always most concerned about, that serve a very short-term, kind of short-focused point of view, like achieve results and move on, without really considering the long-term implications, because inevitably someone's going to have to pick up those pieces.
Well intended was the first thing that crossed my mind when I thought about this kind of thing. And no one's ever setting out to give bad advice. Some people may be ideologically driven to give less than useful advice, but it always comes from a place of wanting to help other people. And I think when we try and reduce ideas down, because we live in a time where we know quite a lot about a lot of things, but we're always trying to make sure that the busy teacher can access them. And I think some ideas just don't deserve a one page. They deserve the time that it takes to develop things. And when I think about you guys, your approach to professional development, I think you have spent a concerted amount of time thinking about what the future looks like and how you're going to get there. And I think it's knowing when to, is pithy the right word? Where we describe things really accurately and succinctly, and when to actually go into the detail, because there are certain elements of our craft that deserve a lot more of our time, I think, because if we try and rush it, then that's when we get to the sort of the soundbite advice. So yes, I 100% with you, Tom. The first thing that crossed my mind was, no one's doing this on purpose, but sometimes we should halt, because I'm sure there are times that I give them advice that I would probably cringe at, months later, years later, but at this point in time, I can't remember any examples.
No, I'm sure we could all think of things we've said at some point and gone, actually, that wasn't the right long-term thing to say. I have a slightly, potentially controversial one, and I need to think about how to word this, because it could come out very poorly, especially considering I have a new book coming out, which certainly features what I'm about to say. So I think some years ago, there was a very well-intentioned and like correct emphasis on concrete pictorial abstract and the importance of going through this journey. However, I think, like you were saying, Tom, it was very quickly boiled down to just CPA. Well, we do CPA. And I think that possibly some schools and busy teachers have misunderstood the importance of the representation that you're choosing. And I think certainly a curriculum provider, I'm not going to name, has taken the idea of many representations and really, you know, going to town on what visuals you show the children. And because said curriculum provider jumps around quite a lot between visuals and representations and doesn't, I think, do a good enough job of the initial introduction of a representation or a structure or using a concrete manipulative to look at the structure, I think that's done more damage than good, because it's left children confused, it's left concepts poorly taught. And I think because there hasn't been, in many places, I'm not saying everywhere obviously, in lots of places there hasn't been the right amount of PD and time into really unpacking what that CPA journey looks like and feels like and why you would choose different representations. And there's been, in some cases, our school has invested in every manipulative going for every child. I'm going to put that tray of manipulatives on the table in all lessons, but never really teach them. And there's been an overuse of, or an over-reliance on materials provided by curriculum makers that actually aren't doing a great job of it. And then what we've left with is de-skilled teachers who haven't had to do as much thinking, who haven't had to think about which representations they choose, so their subject knowledge has reduced and weakened. And now we're left with teachers who maybe aren't as confident when it comes to the actual planning and teaching of maths. And when they have to adapt or they have to supplement something that they're using, maybe they don't have that skill set and that knowledge. And you've also got a whole host of ECTs, or, you know, in their first 5 years, let's say, teachers who came through that system of training, doing their placements in schools that worked in this way, and now don't have that knowledge. And I think that there is not an understanding of how maybe mathematical understanding develops, and the importance of accurately choosing a representation that's going to do a really good job, that really exposes a structure. And so just the really lazy, we do CPA is my piece of advice. But that's not to say I don't believe in any of that, because obviously I do. But it has to be done well. But done poorly, it confuses children.
Yeah, and I think I agree with so much of that, Shannen, and I think it's not limited to maths. Like poorly implemented schemes that have often been rolled out too quickly without the supporting PD, without explaining what the teacher needs to understand, add, supplement and build on, can often do lots of harm. And we've kind of gone through several curriculum revolutions in the last 10 years or so. And often schools have tried to change lots of curriculum areas all at the same time. You know, that kind of the push to be better and the push to add more emphasis, more CPA and maths, more knowledge rich in science, etc. And in doing so, in this hurry to move along our kind of curriculum development timetable really quickly, it's neglected the teacher in this and the value of the teacher's knowledge. You know, how great it would be if every teacher had the knowledge that we have, you know, on this call, to be able to go, oh yeah, I see where the intention behind these representatives are. So I'm going to use these examples and I'm going to build it onto what they've done there. And I'll show how this representation aligns with these manipulatives to reveal the conceptual understanding underneath. And unfortunately, the pace of curriculum change has left so many teachers just clinging on to whatever that purchased resource is. And in the case of free resources, teachers will pick that up and go, step one says I do this, and I'll show all of these things. So if I show all of these things, it's like spaghetti on the wall. If some of it's cooked, then I can move on, you know, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, that doesn't lend itself to long-term sustainable learning. So yeah, I completely agree. The idea of CPA alone isn't enough, especially when it's been boiled down to we do C, then P, and then A. And I'm going to show you this manipulative, and you're going to use this manipulative to calculate the answer to these questions. And you're going to offload all the cognitive thinking to these tiles or these tools or these beads. And when they go, radically, those ideas should just stick in your brain. And surprise, surprise, they don't.
I mean, what really interests me there, Tom, is that you're eating the spaghetti after you've thrown it at the wall. You said if something's cooked,
never waste food, Kieran. Never waste food.
I've never thought about it like that before. I thought we were just throwing stuff at the wall for the fun of it. You know, when you're kids, you just enjoy throwing like spaghetti and meatballs.
You should see what we did with pasta dough and pizza dough.
Yeah, I mean, but it like what you guys are describing probably speaks to like much bigger issues within the system, because we can't invest in PD if we literally do not have the funding to do so. And you know, and like, yeah, because like, I mean, I don't know if
Kieran, sorry, I would say the patience to do so, right? Like, if we're going to implement this thing well, we need to be patient and we need to take our time and do it properly. And do we have enough patience to do that with all 12, 13 subject areas in the curriculum state? And I would say that most schools don't have that patience. This is what our new school leaders have kind of grown up in the system experiencing. So they've experienced a lot of what I would call instigation as opposed to implementation. They've seen a lot of things being brought in, but they've not seen anything properly be sustained and have that long-term impact. And they've gone through their teacher, senior leader, head teacher journey and got to that pinnacle. And they've seen how to get the ball rolling on things, but they've not necessarily lived the experience of keeping the ball rolling. And my fear is if lots of the people at the top of the education pyramid are experienced instigators, but not necessarily experienced at sustaining that change, then we're asking a lot of heavy lifting of our middle leaders to do something that the people leading them have never done before.
Yeah, and I think that bears out in like the MPQs and the fact that sustaining change over time is normally the bit that people struggle most with. I know, Shannen, you obviously did a bit of marking and stuff on it. And certainly my experiences, you know, would match up with what you're describing there, Tom. And I think like the school's guide for implementation, I think the most thumbed bit of the book should be the implementation strategies at the end, because I reckon school leaders should be looking at those and asking themselves, have we tried this? What's the research behind that? You know, because like I said, if we're not experienced at making things last for a long time, and quite often school leaders maybe aren't there for a long time. But if you're thinking, okay, this is a 10-year project, what do I need to sort of to make sure this is sustained, even if I'm not there, and actually exploring the research, because like some of the research they got is really interesting. Like the I always talk about, what do you call them, the opinion leaders, the thought leaders within a school. And that's not necessarily the SLT. That's the teaching assistant who has been there for 40 years and commands the staff room because they're through sheer personality and through their longevity in a place. So they are the sort of the life. Is it the lifeblood of the school? The life breath? I don't know. But like that comes from research in the NHS, and then talking about their equivalent staff rooms, and so it might be like the I don't know, the sister who's on the ward. I don't know if they still call them sisters here. I don't know, but they certainly do back home. So they're not the most senior person, but they're the person who makes sure everything works on time and that kind of thing. So those exploring those kind of things, which aren't necessarily the ABCs of school leadership, I think can be really, really powerful. So there might be a world in which that doesn't have to be the case, but yeah, I think because it's even the same with like when you think about the way we teach mathematics and the way lots of our current head teachers were forged in the old way of teaching mathematics, or like in the differentiation by task and that kind of thing. So I think it's always a cycle we're competing with, which hopefully, if this new review gives us another 10 years where there are no curricular changes, certainly in terms of the core subjects, then perhaps we have a chance to develop. I don't know, what is that likely, or am I just being too optimistic there?
I think it's good to be optimistic, and I think if we aren't optimistic, then we all potentially become that person in the staff room that's been in education for 40 years and has seen 100 instigated changes never land and never embed. Because a lot of the kind of the worry those highly invested TAs, support staff, have is they've seen so much change and they've seen so very little sustain. So they are rightfully skeptical. And they need to be proven that it needs to be proven to them that this change will actually make a long-term difference, and that we're in for that long-term change. And even if we're not the person there, this thing that we're bringing about has got sustainability built into it. And, we've thought about succession planning and those kind of things. And again, that only really happens if the thing we're bringing about very closely aligns to the school's why. Like, what are we trying to achieve here? And, we've got to stick with that, and we've got to sell that to everybody involved in that change.
Yeah, it's almost like the thread that's run through these is that none of these can be answered in isolation by, it has to be a whole school. This is based on decisions that have been made about other things, and yeah, so that's really coming through as I'm listening to you guys.
And that might be, Kieran, because we're both deputy heads now, and we're responsible for both. We're in both camps, right? We've got a foot in the classroom, and we've got a foot in the SLT meetings, and you're living both parts of it. And yeah, so for us, like, it's that kind of, this only matters if it really matters, and if it doesn't really matter, and if it's not going to last, then
we're not doing
it.
What would you actually do? Emphasis on the actually. Do on a Monday morning with a child in year 4 who still relies on counting in ones for basic addition and subtraction. So they've got a count all strategy, and they're going to use it by hell or high water. What approach are you guys taking to support this child?
I think I would want to just hit pause for a sec and not support them to continue what they're doing, but actually work out what they can do and where they are. So, because they clearly need some number sense, and they've perhaps not got it, and they're overly reliant on this one method that will not see them through their primary school maths career. So like working out what this child actually can do. So like, can they subitize? What number bonds do they know? If they're pushed, are they at a place where they can partition any numbers? Just get a feel for where they are, because I can understand the temptation to, in that moment, go, let me think of what kind of resource I can use, what manipulative, what representation I can use to support you in this moment. But there is clearly a deeper issue and a lack of understanding conceptually of who knows how much. So it's worth backtracking, because otherwise what's going to happen is every teacher and every TA, anyone who comes into contact with this child and sees them counting with their fingers, will just in the moment go, how can I adapt this to support you? Rather than just saying, we need to slow down before we can speed up, and we need to work out what this child genuinely does and doesn't know. And sometimes that's a bit scary to say, oh no, this isn't the right thing to do. And sometimes it means giving them something to do that keeps them busy for a bit until you can actually spend the time with that child unpacking their mathematical understanding capabilities. But I don't think I would let them carry on without that knowledge, because then you can genuinely plan for that child. But getting some sort of resource or something to help them in the moment is just a bit of a sticking plaster over what is a bigger issue, presumably. And actually, it might end up being not a bigger issue. They might be able to do some of those things. They might just not have made the connection that that knowledge is useful. So working out what they can do first and then building on it, I think, is what I would do.
Ultimately, we can't just approach that child as an object that does maths, right? They're a human, they've got some understanding. Their understanding might be limited, it might be extensive, but in this particular moment, they're hugely reliant on a strategy for some unknown reason, and we've got to unpack what that reason is. And if that reason is a lack of number sense, then yeah, programs like Number Sense, the program with the same name, might be really useful for that child if they are helped to navigate it with a really knowledgeable teacher that can help them really understand the connections within and between number and those kind of things. And that's a really useful place to start. But yeah, I haven't really got anything different to add to what Shannen's said already. You've got to understand what is the limits of that child's understanding, what's the barrier to them going forwards. Is it purely a confidence thing? Is it that they actually feel highly competent in what they're doing right now and they don't see a potential need to change? This might be a potentially very capable child who's happily counting in ones because they've never been asked to do more than that. And they've never been given a question whether counting in ones didn't work for them. So until you unpack the why, I don't really know. But if it's a number sense issue, then yeah, finding the appropriate program and a suitably trained and knowledgeable adult is a great first step.
I guess if you unpack that it's not a number sense issue, and that they can do those things, like you said, they're just choosing the thing they're relying on. It's about equipping them with the confidence and the kind of toolkit to make them feel like they can expand their strategies. I don't want to jump to assumptions and go they have a number sense issue, but that's probably something we've seen many, many times between us. And I think we can probably all think of children that have just been plonked on that conveyor belt of going, well, I'll support them in the moment to help. They then don't have the understanding. They then aren't achieving and they're not particularly successful. They get passed to another teacher. And then we just repeat it. And I think you just have to stop sometimes and say, I have to work this out and play detective. And that's sometimes quite enjoyable as a teacher, isn't it? To go, oh, what is the thing that you're missing? Let me work this out, because that will make you better. That will make you learn more and learn better. So yeah, I think having the confidence to press pause and go backwards a little bit is probably the thing that will make them more successful going forward.
Yeah, because ultimately, if we're not about finding out what that child needs to do next and helping them achieve it, then what are we about? Because that's the job. So we should relish the opportunity to do that.
Sometimes I will hear this almost described as, I've got kids in my class who are working at year one level. and I'm not fond of hearing that, because I'm not really sure what that means. And I'm not really sure it can be as prevalent as I hear it, if that makes sense. I mean, from listening to you guys are going to be putting something in place where it's necessary, but you're going to be looking for root causes. You're going to be looking for an understanding of what that pupil needs. How frequently will that need be a completely different or earlier part of the trajectory than the majority of their peers?
So is the question, how prevalent is it, Kieran, that we need something completely different for a child in the classroom?
And certainly, how often would you be recommending that to your teachers as an advice? Because obviously you're both senior leaders with significant mathematics experience, so you're probably the person in school that people are coming to. How frequently would you be saying, oh yeah, we need to give these guys a different part of the national curriculum?
I love Tom's thinking face.
It's the only face I've got. I have children that I support in our school at the moment who do need a profoundly different curriculum. They have an EHCP that clearly states where they're at in their learning and what they need next and those kind of things. And I've never known the level of need in the mainstream education system that I see now, right? So I'm seeing it more than I've ever seen it before. However, even those children with the most profound need are often accessing the mainstream lesson to some degree. So it's probably not as prevalent as people might assume it would be, because often when we're talking about children with a significant executive function need or a communication and language need, there's rarely parts of the curriculum where they can't access any of it. So whilst children might need adapted parts of the curriculum, I've still very rarely come across cases where children need an entirely different curriculum. I think that's what I'd say.
I am inclined to agree to an extent. So before this year, I think there were probably maybe two or three in a school, and I've spent the early parts of my career in a two-form school, and then I've just been on a one-form train because I like teaching in one-form schools because I'm a control freak. And I can think of very small numbers in each of the schools that I'm like mentally backtracking through. I think what can happen though is where schools have had high turnover of staff and potentially some less than ideal teaching, you are going to find more of those children. So we have more than I think is normal of those children who genuinely need something different. This afternoon, I was in a conversation with the head and our Senko, looking at a tiny number of children who need something entirely different and away from their peers for various reasons, which doesn't really go with our ethos of being inclusive, but it's right for those children initially. And then in each class, I can think of one or two per class, I would say, in our school, who just, because the need at the moment is so significant. And we've got children who, like you alluded to, Tom, where they would have been in a specialist provision 10 years ago. And now they're not. They're very much mainstream children, particularly at least for primary. And if they have been in that sort of position where they haven't had the right teaching at the right point, given the right access points, exposed to the structures and the representations that will genuinely help them, particularly if you get higher up the school, you're going to find more of them, which is when you have to do something drastically different. I mean, the key to this is to be having the best teaching ever in early years in year one, isn't it? And you have more solid foundations. You'll always have those children with an EHCP or one on the way where they may need something different, but that can still be within their classroom. And a lot of, like you said, a lot of the time they can access some parts of that curriculum, and it doesn't need to look too different. But no, that I've come across more this year than I have before. And whether that's an indicator of where we're going as a system because of the lack of specialist provision places and because of the emphasis on keeping those children in mainstream, particularly for primary, or it's indicative of the things that have happened in my school previously. I think it's a combination of the two. I'd be interested to see in 5 years' time how many of them we have then. Because if I look at our current receptions and year ones, none of them are getting anything that is drastically different. There's obviously adaptations, but appropriate adaptations. And actually year two as well. I'm picturing all of Key Stage 1 and early years now. Whereas you hit Key Stage 2 and you start to see those children who the gaps are vast. The difference between them and their peers is noticeable and can't just be fixed with a little adaptation in the moment or a slightly different task. They need some of our children need different teaching. But I would say most children, like this in the example, who are using their fingers to count, don't have any diagnosed need, don't have any HCP, but are just still overly reliant on those early strategies and haven't been exposed to the many ways that you can like manipulate numbers and be fluent. I think the majority of them probably need a really solid bit of number sense intervention, whether that is number sense with capital N, capital S, or just some in-house number sense. And will put them in a better position to access the rest of their curriculum, is my gut.
I thought you guys dealt that very diplomatically. I thought also really good advice. I think the landscape is changing. If you go full circle, I think that what you guys have mentioned about, you know, it brings to mind the idea that the opportunity to think with almost what you would describe as adaptive expertise is almost like the entitlement. And, you know, Toll and Gray say that the kids who don't have that expertise, they do twice the work for half the payoff and vice versa. So what we as teachers can do is we can think about how we're going to give our pupils that entitlement, because quite often it's perhaps the fact that that's been missing that is the core issue. But actually, where there are need, and given the need is growing within the system, there are perhaps there are other ways that we can support those pupils, and that will involve specialist support. So really interesting, because like I said, I think that's a question that gets asked a lot, but I do think there are, it starts with some introspection, perhaps, and then building out from there. So, I mean, I think we've gone way deeper into any of these questions than I thought we might do. I hope that the people who asked the questions felt positive. I mean, Tom, we've got one on reading coming up where we'll ask your question again, so that in case there's a different phonics answer, because obviously my phonics teaching is limited, and I probably am not the best person to take advice on that, but we'll see. So all I said to do is say thank you very much for joining me, guys. Thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely to be back.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Kieran, and congratulations on 300 episodes. Amazing.
Woo!
Yeah, I mean, you can tell how tired I am in the heat. I wasn't very excited. I was very overly self-deprecating, but it's a huge thing. And thank you very much to everyone for listening, and to everyone at home. Until next time, thanks for listening.